Hi, I'm Yulia, and this is the News Brief special, although at this point it's not that special. Today we're going to be talking about the third anniversary of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, well, full-scale aggression. Actually, it's been 11 years. We're going to talk about Zelensky's press conference in honor of the event, and of course Trump, because how do we deal without Trump? And as per usual, we're going to discuss all of this together in the comments, because you don't want to suffer alone, and I don't want to suffer alone. Leave your questions, suggestions, thoughts, advice in the comments down below, because I read all of it and it helps me greatly and I love hearing from you. Let's get it. As you might know, Monday, February 24th was the third anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion into Ukraine. And while Trump talks about how much Putin wants peace, Ukraine has experienced one of the largest drone attacks since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. In fact, I think it was a record amount of drones that had flown into our airspace that day. It was 267, but correct me if I'm wrong. It's 260 something. And honestly, sitting in an apartment in central Kyiv, it felt like quite a lot, because days leading up to it, there were lots of drone attacks as well, and they keep getting closer and closer. I could see what you would think are fireworks out of my window, but actually are air defense working and intercepting drones, and it was very loud, and it felt like my walls were moving, and overall, it was a very horrendous thing to participate in unwillingly. And that only summarizes how much Russia actually wants peace. Let's fast forward to some claims that Trump made that were directly addressed at Zelensky's press conference. In fact, such a famous press conference that it kind of shook up the world in support of Ukraine all over again. And also shook up Ukrainians in support of Ukraine. Because, you know, we were joking, obviously we criticize our government, because why wouldn't we? It's our democratic right. But the second that Trump called Zelensky a dictator, his approval rating skyrocketed and everyone stood behind him. Even his biggest opponents. Petro Poroshenko, our former president, and Yulia Tymoshenko, our former candidate for president and also a former prime minister, both spoke out in support of him, which really says a lot because they hate him, and Poroshenko especially. They ran against each other in the election, which Zelensky ended up winning. But when Trump called him a dictator, it's very interesting that he would say that, especially during a time that he's completely ransacking and ravaging through the American government and doing things that are considered very anti-democratic everywhere else in the world. So here are some things that stood out to me, apart from the famous phrase that we will mention in a minute. One is that the press conference started with Zelensky letting far-right media outlets or right-leaning media outlets that are incredibly critical of him, open the press conference. And he also let them ask the first questions. Those are outlets that normally write quite unfavorable things about him. And what dictator would ever let that happen? None. Because, for instance, in contrast to that, Trump recently said that he does not want reporters in the White House at his press conferences that write unfavorable things about him. So, you know, compare, contrast. Maybe a bit of projection here. But anyways, Zelensky actually offered to step down as the leader of Ukraine in exchange for Ukraine's membership in NATO. And he said, and I quote, "If it guarantees peace for Ukraine, if you really need me to resign, I'm ready. I can exchange it for NATO." And you know, I mean, obviously on the surface is a very powerful quote, but if you try to dig deeper, no dictator would ever decide to relinquish his post as president or dictator in favor of the well-being of his people. And this is exactly what Zelensky offered to do. He offered specifically to step down if that means that Ukraine can join NATO and Ukrainians can stop experiencing war and have lasting peace guarantees. So that contrasts everything that Trump has said about him. Zelensky is an elected leader with 75% of the population voting for him, 75+% of the population voting for him. And of course, you can challenge that by saying, oh, but he didn't run an election during martial law while it's unconstitutional. But he's also saying, hey, I'm not going to be president for years. I'm not trying to stay president. I'm just trying to stay president during martial law until I can guarantee the well-being and sovereignty and a lasting peace for my people. The second that happens, I'm happy to go. And I always mention this interview with David Letterman where Zelensky quite literally said, after being asked if he would run for the second term, that he hasn't thought that far ahead. He just wants to go to the beach and drink some beer. Yeah. Massive dictator. In this press conference, Zelensky also directly pushed back to the deal for $500 billion in rare earth minerals that the US is demanding Ukraine sign. And if you think to yourself, but US deserves some compensation, well, to date, actually, contrary to what Trump says, Europe has provided a lot more aid than the US, and the US actually provided under $100 billion. So receiving back $500 billion for $100 billion is not quite right. And again, this was aid, not a loan, but Trump now is trying to make it into a loan. And interestingly, before I go into what Zelensky said, I want to show you this clip of Macron recently at the White House, actually yesterday, on Monday, has corrected Trump and humbled him and showed him that, you know, there are world leaders that actually still have a grip on what's going on and don't lie. So here's that clip.
Will France support the U.S. being compensated?
I support the idea to have Ukraine first being compensated because they are the ones to have lose a lot of their fellow citizens and being destroyed by these attacks. Second, all of those who paid for could be compensated, but not by Ukraine, by Russia, because they were the one to aggress.
Again, just so you understand, Europe is loaning the money to Ukraine. They get their money back.
No, in fact, to be frank, we paid 60% of the total effort, and it was through, like the US, loans, guarantee, grants, and we provided real money. To be clear, okay. We have 230 billion frozen assets in Europe, Russian assets, but this is not as a collateral of a loan because this is not our belonging. So they are frozen. If at the end of the day, in the negotiation we will have with Russia, they're ready to give it to us. Super. It will be loan at the end of the day, and Russia will have paid for that.
If you believe that, it's okay with me. But they get their money back, we don't, and now we do. But, you know, that's only fair.
To do so.
Yeah. Europe is not getting payback from Ukraine. Europe actually mostly aids Ukraine, and it's understandable provided that in these circumstances, also according to Macron, what he's worried about now is not him being paid back, Europe being paid back, or the US being paid back, but he's worried about Ukrainians being paid to be able to stand guard against Russia and the evil that it brings, and I think that says everything. In the meanwhile, here's what Zelensky said as to why this $500 billion deal is absolutely not on the table.
This is for a fact. I'm not going to recognize 500. Whoever says about it, with all due respect, with all respect to partners, you know, I'm very solid on that because this is the real situation and we are completely right. Actually, I wouldn't be ready to agree to 100 billion. Why? Because we should not recognize grants as debts, like it or not. But I had agreed it with Biden, with the US Congress, and I'm thankful to the Congress in presence of two parties, there was support via grants, and grants make no debt, so we should not be returning this debt. Maybe some would say this is not just, but that had been the earlier agreement. It had been about grant money, so it's not a matter of a figure. It's a matter of us not recognizing as a debt. So maybe we have to agree to it, but I have a question, a logical one, and no one seems to be able to answer me this question. When the United States of America sell their weapons to Israel, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, do they get 100% markup? Just a normal thing. I just want a dialogue with President Trump. I think I'm just in my want of a dialogue. I'm not signing something that will have to be repaid by generations and generations of the Ukrainians.
Again, coming back to the dictator comment, of course, Of course, any dictator would care about how many generations of his people it would take to pay back, because he would so care about the well-being of the people, right? Right? There is no space for emotions here, said Zelensky, referring to Trump's remarks about him. The Ukrainian leader said, obviously, I would not say President Trump's words about me are compliments, to say the least. And that's how he reacted to being called a dictator, which, I mean, any dictator really, if they were called a dictator, would be furious and would cause some sort of ruckus. Zelensky doesn't care because he knows it's not true. And, actually, this press conference was so successful, and him showing how much he cares about his own people and how much he can really get it together during crisis earned him the support of leaders worldwide and also Ukrainians. So Twitter, Threads, and all of the other social media networks erupted in people from different countries writing messages like this, where they're saying, we support Ukraine with every fiber of our being. They were reaffirming their support. Americans were saying that, our government does not reflect what we think. And everyone really was taking this very, very to heart, and everyone was reacting, both to Trump's message of Zelensky being a dictator and how he has been acting towards Ukraine, and of course, after Zelensky's press conference. Even Piers Morgan chimed in. Piers Morgan, referring to his conversation with Tucker Carlson, where Tucker called Zelensky a dictator. Piers responded on Twitter to Zelensky's words and saying he would step down as, oh, dictator indeed. Thanks, Piers. I do love the feistiness here. And of course, basically, all of the world leaders have supported Zelensky, and all of them have shown their respect and full backing behind Ukraine and behind our government and behind our people. And interestingly, I think what Trump was trying to do is he was trying to show himself as this big, big leader who is so strong and who is, getting the U.S. to be paid back what U.S. deserves and all of this stuff. Meanwhile, what he came off as to the world as untrustworthy, someone that shouldn't be an ally, and also just a very superficial, egotistical person who does not care about others. Because in reality, a crisis somewhere is a crisis everywhere. And as you might know, Germany just had an election, and of course Elon Musk and Trump were backing the AfD, Alternative for Germany, or Alternative für Deutschland party, which is basically Germany's far-right party. And while they have earned more support than they have ever since World War II, they still didn't quite win, even though Musk and Trump were celebrating it as if they did and called the leader of AfD. But likely it's going to be a center-right party forming a coalition either with the current party or with the Greens. And Friedrich Merz won the election as the chancellor for Germany, so he's going to be replacing Olaf Scholz. Now we know that Merz has always been incredibly pro-Ukrainian. He has shown his stance many, many times, and he has even said that he would give Ukraine Taurus, which, hey, can't wait. But anyways, Merz, after winning, really went rampant on the United States and on criticizing the current government. After President Trump's remarks last week, it is clear that this government does not care much about the fate of Europe, said Merz. He also said that whether we will still be talking about NATO in its current form at the next NATO summit in June, or whether we will have to establish a European defense capability much more quickly, is undetermined. In a news conference on Monday, he told reporters it is 5 minutes to midnight for Europe on defense. His bold rhetoric is at odds with the weak hand voters gave him. The CDU's 28.6% of Sunday's vote is its lowest margin of victory since the party was founded in 1949. Well, they're going to be forming a coalition, and Merz still has a lot of political power. He also thinks that the U.S. is throwing Ukraine to the wolves. Merz is in accelerated talks to form a centrist grand coalition with the Social Democratic Party, which was ousted from office. His CDU, along with the Christian Social Union, could rule with 360 members in the 630-seat Bundestag, the German parliament. But they would have to iron out their differences on foreign policy, defense, and economic policy that underpins them. CPD leader Olaf Scholz has staunchly refused to deliver 500-kilometer range Taurus missiles to Ukraine. Merz said last October that he would do it if Russia refused to stop attacking Ukrainian civilians. Moscow consistently denies targeting civilians in its war in Ukraine. Merz clearly thinks that the U.S. is throwing Ukraine to the wolves and providing weaponry for Ukraine could strengthen its hand. Timothy Less, senior advisor for geopolitics at Cambridge University Center for Risk Studies, told Al Jazeera. But doing so will be complicated. German society is divided on question of military support for Ukraine, and so is SPD. Well, if you looked at the German elections map, it truly does look like Germany is two different countries, because it is very crystal clear and there is a clear division of who voted for who. However, again, the coalition will be formed. I'm sure they'll iron out their differences, because it does look like, after what Merz has said, Germany does not consider the U.S. an ally, and they think that the U.S. does not give, for security of Europe or what happens to Europe one way or the other. And he is not keen on, dancing in front of the Trump administration and pretending to like them. He says it the way it is. He's a straight shooter and a straight talker, and as much as I need to do a lot more research on him to understand how I actually feel about him as a politician, I do really like that quality, because that reminds me of what Zelensky does, a no bullshit approach. Also, of course, most of the European leaders have backed Zelensky. For instance, Keir Starmer said that Zelensky is a democratically elected leader who was elected by a landslide in the country, and that he is a legitimate leader. No one in Europe stood with Trump on his words against Zelensky. And of course, as I mentioned priorly, it caused a huge reaction. So at the end of the day, what I think is important to understand from this entire situation, both the press conference, what's happening in the world, Trump's remarks, Trump's kind of alliance with Russia, where he's quite literally saying that he's considering trade with them, would like to see them back in the G7, kind of throwing Ukraine to the wolves and under the bus, is that Trump considers himself king. And he said that too. And he thinks that absolutely everybody, especially in Europe, praise onto the U.S. and its approval so much that they're going to do whatever it is that he says. So he wanted to show himself as this strong person who does whatever they want and who doesn't follow the rules or moral codes and just earns money for himself or the United States. And in contrast to that, it backfired on him, because the entirety of Europe is now gathering together against him, but not necessarily in a very, provocative way, but in a way where they're correcting him, they're dismissing him, they're telling him that he's wrong. Absolutely most of world's news organizations are talking about how ludicrous it is for him to say these things, while he's quite literally praising Putin. And, of course, there is also this little bit that came out about him recently that, allegedly, Donald Trump was recruited into the KGB in the 1980s under a pseudonym Krasnov, FSB, and that he has been a Kremlin agent all along, and that there is a huge dossier on him and a lot of compromat, and of course he would be acting in Russia's interests. And realistically, if you look at all of his actions in the past 1 month that he's been president, it really does look like he serves Russia more than he serves the United States. Because also, if you look at the US stock market that is fully red as compared to Russia's stock market that is fully green, directly affected by Trump's actions, whose country is he really trying to make great again? The point is that his egotism, bold moves, and crudity really did not pan out as well as he thought it would. It, on the contrary, isolated him and made America look weak, made America look Russian apologist, and made America look weak. For the first time since World War II, the rest of the free world leaders and leaders of countries that really have a lot of political pull do not take neither America nor Trump seriously. And it's not that they're afraid of them. It's that no one really wants to have anything to do with America. And even if Trump wasn't saying all of this stuff, he's just so volatile that it's really not a worthwhile investment. And it is very evident from how all of the world leaders are humbling him. Scholz also stood up for Zelensky, saying that the fact that regular elections cannot be held in the middle of a war is in line with the requirements of the Ukrainian constitution and electoral laws. No one should claim otherwise. Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson also said Trump's use of the word dictator was incorrect, while Germany's Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock called the comments absurd. If you look at the real world instead of just firing off a tweet, then you know who in Europe has to live in the conditions of a dictatorship. People in Russia, people in Belarus, Baerbock told public broadcaster ZDF. Burn. The leader of Germany's largest opposition party and now elected chancellor, Friedrich Merz, said that Trump's comments were a classic reversal of role of perpetrators and victims. To be honest, I'm somewhat shocked that Donald Trump has obviously made this his own. French President Emmanuel Macron posted on X that Ukraine must always be included and its rights respected, as he outlined 3 conditions that he described as France's effort for peace. Both Macron and Starmer are meeting with Donald Trump at the White House, so I'm sure we have heard from Macron. I am very curious to hear from Starmer and how that went. All in all, there has been a flurry of support across Europe for Volodymyr Zelensky's legitimacy as president of Ukraine after the US President Donald Trump called him a dictator. Trump's remarks in a post on Truth Social came a day after Zelensky said Trump was living in a bubble of Russian disinformation, which, he is. He also might be Agent Krasnov. Trump also said that Zelensky better move fast to negotiate an end to the 3-year war or risk not having nation to lead. Ukraine has been under martial law since the Russian invasion in February 2022, and the country's constitution prevents elections taking place under such circumstances. The European Commission said that Ukraine is a democracy and that Zelensky is a fairly elected leader. We have a very direct and clear position on this matter. President Zelensky was legitimately elected in free, fair, and democratic elections, European Commission Deputy Spokesperson Stefan de Klerksmaker told reporters on Thursday. And again, to sum this all up, for a modestly successful comedian who is now a dictator and does a terrible job, which is Trump words about Zelensky, it's really interesting how what Trump said to fire at Zelensky backfired at him, and now he has virtually no support worldwide, and Zelensky has all of it, and so does Ukraine, because he truly does represent us, and that's all I want to say today. So thank you for watching and listening. If you did enjoy this episode, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all of your notifications so you don't miss when the next episodes come out. Also, share it with a friend, your mom, your grandma, your grandpa, I don't know, anyone you feel like might enjoy watching this. And of course, give this video a like and leave your thoughts, comments, suggestions, and I don't know, anything you want to say down below. I read all of it. I enjoy hearing from you guys. You know this. And sometimes I even include these things in the next episodes because they need to be addressed. So anyways, see you next time.